Hello, everyone. Today I'm talking to Colette Fehr. Thank you so much for your time, Colette.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So, can we start, please, by just a little bit about why you chose to write on the topic of avoidance in relationships and what you mean when you say many of us might quiet quit our relationships?
Yeah. So thank you for that question because it really ties to the heart of the book and the why, which is my personal story and my professional experience. I got married very young to a man I met in college, actually on the first day of school when I was only 18 years old. And I had come out of an environment where, even though I have wonderful parents, there was a lot of fighting and on and off separation until they finally divorced right around the time that I met the man who would then become my husband. And what I sort of implicitly learned from my home environment was that conflict was bad, fighting was bad, right? People who fought created chaos and unpleasantness. And I felt a lot of anxiety when I would hear my parents argue. They're both very intelligent, strong-minded people. My mom's a lawyer, my dad's a doctor. So there was lots of butting heads, and nobody was quiet in my house. So without really consciously thinking of it, I chose somebody who was very quiet, who came from a family where what I now know as a therapist, conflict was avoided. And they're also lovely people, but this is a very common scenario. So as I was young, I thought, this is great. Nobody ever raises their voice. Everything is just smooth and what I call please pass the butter-ish, right? Like you never heard if anyone was upset, you'd never know. And for a while, I thought that was the answer. But of course, as I got older and I got to know myself more and I became more mature and I had emotional needs, I also realized that my ex-husband was pretty emotionally unavailable. And I'm not criticizing him. You know, we're all the product of our home environments and our age. Generationally, that was quite common. So as I got older, I really longed for a deeper connection. And what would happen is I didn't get good responses when I tried to speak up, and I probably didn't really have a good connection to my own voice either. So I allowed myself to be silenced, and we got divorced. And I think the marriage could have been saved if I had known what I know now and we'd been able to find the proper help. But of course, all of this led me to become a couples therapist. And then I would see this same pattern in so many of my clients and all of these very high-powered, successful women who are running companies and brain surgeons in many cases, very smart and very capable of being assertive at work, but not saying anything at home for fear of rocking the boat. So when I talk about quiet quitting, it really comes down to this idea that if we don't get a great response from our partner, that then we can't communicate. And we end up self-abandoning, and in the long run, destroying our relationships because that avoidance creates disconnection, distance, and disconnection that ultimately leads to a relationship's demise.
Right. And you make the case that the avoidance of conflict can actually be as corrosive, if not more, than conflict itself.
Yes, of course, destructive conflict where people are contemptuous, critical, stonewalling, all of the components and defensiveness that Dr. John Gottman, the leading researcher in the relationship space, I believe worldwide, has found to prove divorce, right? He famously says he can predict if a couple will divorce within 90 seconds of listening to them speak because of those elements of destructive conflict. But what I see much more commonly in 13 years of doing this work at a very intense pace is that most couples are not arguing like that by the time we're mature adults. They are actually avoiding things. They're self-silencing the minute they feel like their partner isn't receptive or they get a not so ideal response.
Yeah. So that's destructive conflict. What does healthier conflict look like?
So healthier conflict is the goal. If you have a long-term relationship or even a relationship of a year that has any depth whatsoever, you're going to have conflict because a relationship should be two people who come together and choose each other and create a secure environment, but also maintain their individual sense of self. And that should inevitably lead to conflict, right? We also seek somebody who's different from us in some ways because a relationship is a system and it seeks balance. So if you don't have any conflict, I would get curious about why and what you're not saying. And the healthy version of it is to lean into those differences in a way that is respectful, where you're communicating assertively, and assertiveness just means being clear and direct, but also kind. And you're expressing your own feelings from the perspective of self rather than blaming and accusing and making assumptions about your partner or raising your voice, right? You're emotionally regulated, you're calm. But if you're angry, you name, hey, when you did this, it made me angry, and I'd like to tell you more about why. And you express yourself in this way that gives your partner the best chance possible to hear you. But then also critically, when your partner decides to share, which hopefully they do, you listen with curiosity and an open mind, knowing most of what your partner feels, what upsets them, their grievances are really more about them than they are about you, and vice versa.
Sounds good.
Right, right. It's not easy though, and there are a couple of reasons why it's challenging.
Yeah. Did you want to share a bit on that?
Sure, sure. I mean, I think first of all, I just want to normalize that because we're wired for attachment, we are pro-social herd animals with an intrinsic drive to connect to safe, reliable others. We know that going back to prehistoric times when we actually lived in herds, that if we were cast out or our relationships ended, we would die. So that's still in our evolutionary wiring. And because of this, our relationships are so important to us, and our romantic relationships are often the most important relationship. So anything, conflict, even if it's not destructive, can feel to our survival system, our reptilian brain, our limbic system, which is our emotional nervous system, can feel like a big threat, right? Our body kind of mobilizes even unconsciously into like, oh no, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. So there's just a very normal human reaction that if you tell your partner something and they're mad at you, let's say, that's scary. We experience that as a threat. But with working on ourselves and embracing this, we can learn to override this and maintain that secure bond. The second reason is, of course, that we grow up in environments where we don't really see this modeled, or we see more unhealthy conflict modeled, arguing like I described with my parents, who again are lovely people. I don't mean to bash them, very close to both of them, but back then people didn't used to be as self-aware about how divorce impacted children. Or more commonly, we see parents who don't address anything at all. They don't fight in front of us. They don't model what is normal in relationships, which is rupture and then repair. And if we don't see that, then we don't know how to do it and we're scared of it.
Yeah, of course. And in your experience working with couples, is this kind of self-silencing more likely to happen when two avoidant leaning people get together, or not necessarily?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a lot of confusion right now because it's become so pop culture
Sure.
popular to talk about attachment styles. And I do talk about them in the book and how they contribute to this and how they don't. So avoidant behavior is different from an avoidant attachment style. If you have two avoidantly attached from an attachment style perspective people, A lot of the time, the relationship just doesn't last because they never address anything. They're always moving away. But avoidant behavior can happen with anybody. Most people have, a spectrum, the ability to be secure in certain relationships, perhaps, and kind of a default of an anxious attachment if a relationship doesn't feel super stable. I know if I date somebody, a man, I'm heterosexual. So if I date a man who is a little more avoidant or emotionally unavailable, I can be quite anxiously attached in those relationships, but I'll still have a tendency to avoid conflict if I'm not very aware and intentional because I don't want to do anything to upset the relationship. So they're different. And I would say somebody avoidantly attached is probably more prone to avoiding conflict altogether, but we all do this, even people who are more secure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so oftentimes people feel unable to communicate because they're scared of their partner's reaction. So obviously in some cases that's legitimate and it can be unsafe. But in those less extreme circumstances, what's the case for kind of taking responsibility for that
Yeah.
element?
So I describe in my book one of my favorite metaphors, the bad partner, the bad communication report card. And it's three D's and an F. So these are some of the most common responses that can shut us down, which are distancing, defensiveness, dismissiveness, and then, of course, fixing. The partner who wants to just jump in and give advice or solve your problem. And that usually comes from an inability to sit with emotions, a feeling of helplessness within them.
Mhm.
So, yes, these responses don't feel great. And you owe it to yourself, man, woman, everybody owes it to themselves to say their truth. This is something ultimately, yes, you're doing it to deepen the relationship, but you're doing for you because we are designed to be connected to our feelings and our needs and to express them. And you can feel it in your body when you make a clear statement that's self-focused about what's hurting you, what's bothering you, and what you need. It feels good. Your whole body goes into a kind of relief. And I see this over and over again when I facilitate it in session. So we really have to persevere. And it's the heart of emotional maturity is if you get a defensive response, let's say, which I hate. I mean, nobody, it does not feel good to get a defensive response. When you do the work to say something kindly, diplomatically, clearly, you're not doing any of these destructive conflict things. You're just expressing something about you. Like, let's say, hey, we talked about, I'll use a very easy example, splitting the dishes duty. And I notice that I'm still doing the dishes most nights, and I feel a bit frustrated about it. And I'm bringing this to you because I really care about our relationship and I don't want to accumulate resentment. Could we talk about it? Right? That's what we call a soft startup, or I like to say taking a delicate dive into the conversation where I'm talking about me. I'm being honest about why I'm bringing it up. My tone is very even. And if I get a defensive response there, that would be frustrating. But then I have the ability, and I would argue the responsibility to say, I'm sharing this with you because I really care and I'm trying to connect and have a deeper conversation. And when you get defensive, it really hurts me. It sends me a message that it's not safe to open up to you about these things or you're not receptive, right? We're not speaking for someone else, but we're letting them know the message we get. Could you please make an effort just to hear me out without getting defensive? And ultimately, we can't control somebody else's response, but we can communicate about how their response lands. And we can tell somebody, every time I bring things up and try to share with you, it seems like I get a defensive response. And then this makes me feel like I don't know what to do. And I fear that this is going to lead to a lot of disconnection. And again, I really care about this relationship. So, can we work on this? There are ways to talk about what's happening because it's really not the dishes, it's really the way you talk about the dishes that's more important.
And what are some of the common avoidant coping strategies that you see in your practice?
So it's interesting. One is obviously self-silencing, and just so many people, I call myself a recovering people pleaser. I made a lot of changes between my first marriage and my second marriage. So that's obviously one of them. Pleasing, appeasing. I call it good girl-itis. That even though we've made a lot of strides in society, I mean, when I was born, women couldn't even get a mortgage or take out a business loan, which is just mind-boggling. But there's still a lot of conditioning out there for women that we're supposed to be nice and put other people before ourselves. And we know from research that women are still judged as aggressive or bossy or mean, and we're not liked and punished if we are just simply assertive when men are told, oh, they're just a great business person. So we got a long way to go, and I think there's still a lot of that people pleasing, self-silencing that is one of the top avoidance strategies. But there are many other ways that people wouldn't really see as avoidant. One of them is bickering, and I call them bickering loops. When that conversation about the dishes, you go back and forth, bickering. You don't do the dishes. You said you would, and you haven't been doing them. Yes, I did. I did them 3 nights. You just don't ever see what I do, right? And the conversation stays at the surface. Nobody's talking about their deeper feelings, their longings, their needs, what it means. Bickering is a way of avoiding true, authentic self-disclosure. And then there are things like criticism, which is very, very common, right? Instead of really talking about you and your feelings and needs, you tell your partner what they're doing wrong, why they're doing it, and make assumptions. Nobody can hear you that way. And another very common one is outsourcing your needs for connection. This goes back to quiet quitting. You kind of say, you know what? I'm not getting anywhere here, so there's no point in trying to say anything. And maybe half the time you're not really communicating yet as clearly as you think you are. And you just kind of give up and you turn to your children or your friends or hobbies for your needs for connection instead of really trying to be in the relationship. And there are more, but those are some of my favorites.
Great. And in a case where someone has really lost touch with their needs and wants and their ability to speak up for themselves, what kind of internal cues could they look out for that might tell them that they really have to do something about something that they're avoiding? What would that look like?
So this is tuning into your feelings and parts of self. It may sound a little bit therapy woo-woo, and I think before I became a therapist, I would have thought so. But we do have an inner child still in there. And whether you want to call it an inner child or just your more vulnerable self, it is normal to have emotional needs. And your body will tell you with sensation when you're feeling emotion. If we're willing to tune in and get curious, we can find the pathway to what we're needing in the moment. What happens far too often for both men and women is we're so quick to dismiss ourselves. We either distract our attention away or we tell ourselves, maybe it's me, maybe I'm being too much. I shouldn't make a big deal about this. Maybe I'm wrong. And what I want to encourage people is that you are never wrong. Your feelings are information processing signals. And this doesn't mean you have to, assert power over your partner, but we want to always tune in and get curious. Ooh, I left that conversation with a little pit in my stomach. I wonder what that means. And you can even close your eyes for a couple of seconds. I do this all the time. And ask yourself directly inside, if this pit in my stomach could talk, what would it tell me? What would make me feel comforted right now? If the ideal could happen, what would I need to hear? Because often our needs are for comfort and reassurance, not just behavior change. Sometimes it's not even behavior change at all. So it starts with a willingness to sit with your emotions, to be curious, and to listen for those internal messages. Everybody has the answers. Women will tell me all the time, well, I don't even know what I need, and men too. And then once I start to ask these questions, like, well, what does that really mean? What is your body telling you? The same questions you can ask yourself. They're like, oh, I did know the answer, right? We just have to dig a little deeper.
Yeah. Yeah. And where does shame come in, both in terms of a partner who might react defensively and in terms of someone who might self-silence?
So this is a great question. Are you a therapist or have you?
Wow. I am a therapist, that's true. Busted.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because that is so spot on. So shame is a big part of all of this. And it's definitely, I would say, the primary driver of defensiveness is feelings of not good enough. All things boil down to about five fundamental negative self-beliefs, but they're often unconscious, right? Now, I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving, there's something wrong with me, which is very much a shame story. And in fairness, a lot of people got these messages directly and indirectly throughout their childhood. They can't help that they see themselves that way, even though it's heartbreaking, right? Because we're all worthy just by virtue of breathing. So if somebody feels not good enough, or less than, it's going to show up over and over in a relationship. They're going to struggle much more to hear feedback, however gently rendered. I would argue that it's very difficult to hear feedback, critical feedback of any kind, even if it's very nicely and appropriately said, just in general for the reasons I explained earlier. But if you have that underlying not good enough, a lot of people can collapse into shame. The tricky part is that they don't always know that they're feeling shame because that defensiveness is a protective part of self that pops out to make sure they don't feel that shame, to make sure they turn it around or explain themselves and they're not seen as bad in their partner's eyes. And so we really have to, in therapy, work with people to help them access the parts of self that are in there, that strong, wise, adult, sage self, I call it, that knows that they are good enough, even though this other part is struggling with shame. So if you are the person who's in a relationship with a partner who has a lot of underlying shame, we can have empathy for that, but that's not your responsibility to tiptoe around that or walk on eggshells. Again, it would be more just to stay in your own lane and take responsibility for your side of the street. You can say something like, I notice that you get defensive often. And I wonder about that. Have you ever gotten curious why? And here's how it impacts me. And we're trying to work as a team, but ultimately, you do have a right to express your feelings as long as you're doing it respectfully, clearly, and vulnerably, no matter how it lands for your partner.
You. And in terms of couples therapy, how might a couples therapist be the right support when it comes to getting out of those loops and those ruts?
So I think if you really try to work on this on your own and you feel very confident, I give a whole process that I call self-connected communication in the book, which is a lot of the things I'm describing very, very briefly here. But I really draw out how you can learn to do this and give you a step by step and scripts for communication. But if you find that you're still struggling with it, you and your partner are still getting stuck, then it might be time to seek help. And I think that more and more people are coming to therapy now, even proactively for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't mean your relationship is headed for divorce or breakup. It doesn't mean there's anything flawed. I mean, I've done couples therapy with my husband a million times. I mean, we've done years of therapy. Poor guy, I've guinea pigged him on everything. Because I think it's healthy for a relationship, and being human means we're going to have these old wounds that pop up in conflict. We're going to have our own blind spots, and it can really help to have somebody moderate, slow you down, get more curious, and learn to build this emotional muscle for communicating this way in session first, where it's a little safer and more contained before it translates outside of the therapy room.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Colette. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. And I really want everybody to be doing this because it's so good for you. So thank you for the opportunity to spread the mission.
Thank you.